So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about this book. I've read this book. Dr. Price has read this book. We really like this book. There's some real wisdom in it. And I'm going to bounce around a little bit today. We're going to talk some about West Point and Bob's time in Vietnam, his time in the Gulf War, what it meant coming up with a military family, all these kinds of things. But Dr. Griffin, what I want to start out with is I think what may have led to this book, it led to your focus on leadership, and you make a recommendation in the book that people who are interested in leadership earlier in their career begin a leadership journal. And you apparently did that at some point in your career. Would you talk about how that came about, how you started deciding to write down your thoughts about leadership, lessons learned, how you used it? To talk about that, please.
Okay, let me also start out, though, with some quick thanks as well, because much of this I really owe a thanks to you, because in reality, I really never thought about writing a book like this. You brought me over here, and I said, okay, well, that was an interesting meeting. Not too long afterwards, you grabbed me, you took me back. and so we went ahead and pursued it. You did a couple of oral interviews, which was very helpful in putting my thoughts together. But then I'd also like to thank Arkansas Blue Cross Blue Shield very much for bringing me back home to Arkansas. It's noted in there that I went to high school in Fayetteville because my dad was stationed here. But I'm an Arkansan by choice, and we plan to stay here. So we're very happy to be with you, and we deeply appreciate not only having Arkansas Blue Cross bring us here, but also their support for the book. There are many other thanks, but David Strickland and the entire Butler Center that put this together, and all the people he mentioned as well. I never, as you go through, I always was raised to serve. I know my dad had plans that he really wanted to be a leader. I never really wanted to lead. It's funny. You go to West Point and you don't really want to lead. Well, I went to West Point because I wanted to be a soldier. I wanted to be an Army officer. And there are a lot of other places in the Army that you can that you can serve that aren't necessarily in a leadership position. I never really liked center stage and being under the pressure. But after West Point and our tour in Hawaii, and then in Vietnam, I got a lot of encouragement by several people who felt that I really had done a good job as a leader, leading my platoon, leading folks into combat. And so it sounded like, well, maybe I ought to be thinking more about this. And if I'm going to be a leader, maybe I ought to look at not what I've learned from lectures and other things, but what are the other great leaders that I have worked with? What do they do? How do they act? How do they relate to people? And as I looked at that, I realized that really I wanted to be like a lot of them. And I wanted a part of this one and a part of that one and some of the others. And the only way I could capture that was by having a journal. And when I saw somebody do something that I thought was really astute in a way of leading or getting people to do things, I noted it down. Likewise, when I saw some things that, people would say or do as a leader that said, damn, I really don't want to follow him. I don't have any choice, but there were the negative parts. And so I captured lessons both from the really great leaders that I served under, as well as the ones that were in the other category.
So how often would you make an entry in your leadership journal?
Not on a regular basis. It was mostly anytime I saw something that I was really impressed with, I would jot it down so I wouldn't forget it.
Okay. You also encourage people to think about leadership, and I think your word was reflect. You didn't just write things down. You thought about them and reflected on them. As, say, a young captain or a major What were your thinking process? You would see something good or bad done by another leader?
Well, part of leadership is, I think, being a good leader ties in with selfless service. And what you want to do is, in at least going to combat, you want to get people to do what they never, ever want to do, which is go forward when people are shooting at you. And it requires certain skills. And so I felt that capturing them was part of what I needed to do. And then as I just saw so many different people, I just mixed it in. So now in my own event, I think I got a lot of positive feedback from people when I led well, which caused me to want to do more of it. I guess people do what they get positive feedback for.
So the first part of the title of the book is Raised to Serve. I want to talk a minute about your family background. And part of that is you use the phrase foundation, that good leaders have good foundation. And I think you relate a lot to that, to your family. Talk about your upbringing in a military family, a kid who moved around a lot, lived overseas. It was not getting in a 747 going overseas. You're on ships with your mom with diapers and all that. Talk a bit about your family background and how the Raised to Serve part of this book.
It goes back to my parents, who were committed to military service. Now, my mother actually grew up in a fairly well-to-do family on Cape Cod, and I don't think the military was anywhere in her mind. But along came World War II, and my father at that time was stationed at Fort Bragg in part of the 9th Division, potentially going overseas. And he was picked out to lead with amphibious warfare and to study the Army's role in that. So he was up at Camp Edwards and met my mother on a weekend. And they hit it off, obviously, because they were married less than 2 months later. And about a year later, my older brother came along, and about a year and a half after that, I came along. So they had a very close family, but my father was always committed to service. And that was what we would see. And we would see that in the people that they served with, about, again, service of the country. They raised us under the principles, I guess, that were iterated by the Boy Scouts of America, going through Cub Scouts, Boy Scouts, Explorer Scouts. Both my brothers and myself were all Eagle Scouts. Scouting itself is got really 3 duties: duty to God, duty to country, and duty to self. And duty to God and duty to country always comes first in that order. And so, again, I think it's a natural thing to want to serve.
When you were a kid in a military family, and there was a lot going on with your dad's career, I think you're quite candid in the book that while there were a lot of good things about that upbringing, there were some downsides too in terms of frequent moves. And I try to think of a word to describe it. I think I don't know if you're talking about kind of being a shy kid or introverted, but how important is it, as someone is looking ahead and thinking they might want to be a leader and develop the skills, that you have that kind of a candid assessment of strengths, personal strengths and weaknesses?
I think clearly you have to take your own personal inventory and decide what you're good at and what you're not so good at. And as a child, what I could tell I was not so good at was leading. And so I wasn't really inclined necessarily in that direction. I watched my parents, and it's described in the book, but for people today, think about my mother, who was 20 at the time, taking 3 boys, 4, 2, and 9 months or 6 months, getting on a train in Boston, taking the train to Chicago, changing trains. My grandmother came to help her, and then taking it on to San Francisco, getting on board a troop ship, and then spending almost a month at sea on a troop ship at a time when there was no pre-prepared formula. There's no powdered formula. You made your own, basically, with evaporated milk and Karo syrup and some other things that I don't want to go into. And then no disposable diapers, nothing but cloth diapers that my mother would wash in the sink or the tub every night and hang out the window. Sometimes it meant her hanging out the window of a car or the boat, holding the diaper until it dried. And of course, one of the three of us, maybe me, had this tendency to run for the rail as fast as he could to see who would catch him. And the rails on troop ships don't guarantee that the rail would have caught me. So ultimately, my mother put me on a leash.
Anne does that sometimes too. I want to ask about West Point. So you're a young man, you head off to West Point. The only thing I grew up knowing about West Point was they played football once a year against Navy. And there was an old movie that there's one scene where somebody had to sit on the cannon all night in the rain. And I suspect most Americans don't know that much more than that about West Point. Talk about your West Point experience, the good, the bad, and the ugly.
It was a shock when I got to West Point. I mean, I'd read a lot about it and the things in terms of what they did, and I want to put it in the context that things are a whole lot different when I went there in 1963 than they are today, having visited there recently, having worked with some of the cadets, participated or led some of their seminars on leadership. It is a different experience today than it was then. I talk about some of the things that you look about that are mentioned in what they teach, the cadet prayer, about suffer not our hatred of hypocrisy and pretense ever to diminish, and how you need to lead people, only to find that most of the time they would stand in your personal space no more than 2 or 3 inches from your face, yell at you, shout commands faster than you could obey them. And it was a steady harassment for the first year. And I really hated it. But the other thing I have is a stubborn streak. And the stubborn streak says, to hell with them, I'm sticking. And I continue to stick around, but I did not learn a lot of positive leadership in my 4 years at West Point.
You use a phrase in your book as examples of, your phrase was truly as abysmal leadership. Is that part of what you saw at West Point?
Yes, that was a good way to describe. Well, since I described it, it had to be a good way.
Magnificent.
Yeah, but it really was the wrong type of leadership, and it caused more people to resent it. Caused a number of very good people to just say, hell with you, I'm leaving. And out of our class that started 850 roughly, we only graduated around 640 or 650, somewhere around there. There's a lot of people left. They just weren't going to put up with it for that sort of thing. And again, I always want to make sure, because some people hear this, I truly believe that has been fixed.
Right. So talk about let's get you out of West Point. You're a young military officer, and the Vietnam War is going on. And talk about between West Point and your time in Vietnam, and particularly when you first met Nick Bacon. Better say, for some of you may not know, Nick Bacon, who passed away several years ago, he was our last living Medal of Honor winner in Arkansas. And Bob will describe the relationship.
Yes. When I graduated from West Point, then I went to Ranger School, which is the Army's premier leadership school for officers and NCOs. And it's a combination of using Ranger tactics to teach people leadership, to evaluate them on leadership. In each class, roughly 1/3 would actually graduate and get the Ranger tabs. And another, maybe less than 1/3 would graduate but not get Ranger tabs, and the others would not complete the course. It was basically, you'd burn about 2,000 calories a day and you'd get one C-ration meal a day. So everybody lost weight. You were under stress from the fatigue, from the intensity of the missions. From there, I went to Hawaii, where I joined the 11th Light Infantry Brigade, which was just forming, and there was one battalion left, which was our battalion, to stand up. The others had left that January for Vietnam. So we had a pretty good idea of where we were going. I had a really great company commander, Dave Treadwell, who was one of the truly great leaders I had, and I started watching him. And since I knew where I was going, I tried to follow him as best I could and to adopt his methods. So he was really, other than my father and some of his colleagues, was the first leader I really tried to pattern myself after. Dave really cared for the soldiers. He really was meticulous about making sure that we set up the right kind of defense in case we were attacked. And basically encouraged us to lead and gave us the opportunity.
And when did you meet Nick?
Nick arrived. Nick had been in Vietnam previously with the 1st Infantry Division. He arrived at the battalion about 2 weeks before we deployed. The other thing that happened at the same time is I actually was an extra lieutenant in the battalion because they had one lieutenant that needed to go, not to Vietnam, but needed to go out of the Army. But they had to document everything first. And so as soon as they did that, then I took over the battalion just before we left. And Nick Bacon arrived like a week or two before we left. Pardon?
You said took over the battalion.
I took over that platoon.
That platoon, yeah.
That he had, that he was not doing well with. And Nick Bacon arrived, and with his experience, I think the company commander deliberately put him with me because I was taking over a platoon that had not been well led, and that with Nick's experience, he thought by then that the two of us would really do a good job. And Nick and I worked really, really well together. First of all, the squad leaders that I had were mostly practically straight out of their basics. So they were all like 18 or 19 years old. Nick was about 21, 22. I was 22. My platoon sergeant was like 43, which seemed awfully old to me then, and awfully young now. So the two of us became fairly close. Nick had one of the squads, but I talk a lot of things over with Nick because I could relate to him fairly well, and I would go out at night sometimes on patrols with Nick, mainly because then we used to like to start fights, which isn't real bright when you're starting fights with guns, but nonetheless, we worked very well together and we became close. I would turn to him for advice as well as the company commander and the platoon sergeant.
Tell us about, so the day that you were there for several months and you and Nick and the other folks were, had a bad day and you got shot in the neck.
Yeah.
And if for any of you who this afternoon, if you'll go on the internet and read the Medal of Honor citation for Nick Bacon that refers to when his platoon commander was wounded, that was Dr. Griffin. Talk about briefly what happened that day.
Well, we were moving forward towards where we knew there was a North Vietnamese we didn't know the size of it. We knew there was at least a battalion, but there was a North Vietnamese force that was moving towards a village called Tam Kỳ, and this was in the lowlands on the coast of Vietnam. So as we moved forward, we were moving with armored personnel carriers and tanks, and the armored personnel carriers would be alongside of us. And as we got closer, we could see the bullets hitting in the sand in front of us. And in a stupid movement of bravado that almost got me, the company commander was going to about bash me in the head with his helmet. But I stood out in the open and made an obscene gesture at the North Vietnamese. But I knew that the bullets couldn't hit us because I could see where they were hitting. But I won't go into what the company commander said to me, but it was quite profane. But anyway, then we moved forward, and as we approached actually the bunker line, to our surprise, the tanks that we thought were going with us stopped and actually went backwards because the North Vietnamese fired rocket-propelled grenades at them. And the IAPC stopped and fired over our head with machine guns. So we were the only ones moving forward. Now, I have to say, I don't remember anything beyond that point when the tanks went back. What I have been told by others and in my own citation was that I then moved forward. I was in the very lead of the first platoon. The third platoon, who was the other platoon that was killed, was my West Point classmate, Joe Pena. And Joe was the third platoon leader, and I think the second platoon was on my left flank a little further back. And so we moved in first. According to what I've been told, I had advanced straight into a machine gun position, dropped hand grenades in there and killed those people, and moved on forward towards the next bunker when I was shot. I do remember being shot because the only thing I remember was it sounded like the biggest Chinese gong in the world going off, and then I felt like I was going in slow motion, just forward on my face. And then I don't remember much after that, but according to what I've been told and there is that, I remember one other thing, I'll get to that, but Nick was in the third squad. He went and he came forward. He rallied Joe's platoon because Joe was killed just a little bit after me. Joe had crawled up apparently on a bunker and had dropped a couple of grenades in and then looked in with his rifle, and apparently was baffled because he hadn't killed the person who shot him in the head. And so Joe was killed, I was wounded, and the company commander was given orders to just pull back. And the orders that he was given by the battalion and squadron commander that we were working with told him to pull everybody back, and they were going to bring in napalm. And at that point in time, myself, 4 of my soldiers, were out forward of where everyone else was. And Nick looked at him and said, "Not leaving without my lieutenant." And the commander said, "No, we got to go. It's the orders." Well, Nick just grabbed his gun and he just went. And he went forward. He got behind a tank and talked on the phone. There's a phone behind each tank so he can talk to the tank crew. And told them where we were and what to do. And he brought that in and got myself and the other 5 soldiers from my platoon that were with me and pulled us back. I remember also being thrown in the back of an armored personnel carrier, and then the driver was killed. He was pulled on top of me, and there were a bunch of bodies in there too. And then they pulled that back. The next thing I remember was that I was having this bright light shining in my eyes, and somebody saying, "Well, there's not much we can do for this poor boy." And unfortunately for me, I heard that because I obviously was in the triage and the expectant category where they weren't going to treat me until after everything else. And I opened my eyes. It was like a shot of adrenaline. Told him I could move my arms and legs, and the next thing I knew, I was in the operating room.
And Nick actually thought you were killed that day.
Yeah. Nick wanted, he went forward because they were going to napalm it. He didn't want, me and the 4 people with me cremated.
So tell me, I want to touch briefly, when's the next time tell us about the phone conversation you had with Nick Bacon?
Well, in those days, after Vietnam, I went on back in the Army. I went to the training company, went to medical school, did some other things. And I was at Forces Command in Atlanta. And in those days, of course, you didn't have the internet connections. You didn't have any Facebook. You didn't have a way really to communicate like we do. We didn't have addresses. But I took advantage of my position there to talk to some other Medal of Honor recipients. And they said, oh, well, here's where Nick is. So I got on the phone and called him. I said, Nick, this is Lieutenant Griffin. He said, no, you're not. He's dead. I said, no, really, I am. No, he's dead. And it took me about 5 minutes to convince him, by talking through it, that no, I wasn't dead. And so after that, I went out and met him here. He was up at Camp Robinson. So we went out to lunch, and then we communicated after that back and forth a little bit better.
And I think you spoke at his memorial service, did you not?
Yes, I attended and spoke at his memorial.
I want to be sensitive to time, Dr. Griffin, I want to hit on some of these themes of leadership. You spent a lot of time rehabbing from your wound, and so your thought process about first wanting to be a pediatrician, then deciding general surgery. But the book, you hit on a lot of themes of kind of lessons learned, and I want to do several of these before we run out of time. One of them, you talk about the higher you get up in leadership, the more your skills decay. Talk about that.
Well, being an infantryman, then and even more so today, requires some fairly intricate skills. Not just your ability with a rifle, but you operate machinery like Bradley fighting vehicles. You have to be able to do the quick maintenance on your machine guns and your other equipment. You know all this well when you're doing it, but you're doing it every day, and it's a natural sort of thing. The further you go up in distance and time you get away from it, the less skillful you are at doing it.
How about in the civilian world?
In the civilian world, it's much the same thing. If you're using Arkansas Blue Cross is a good example, but if you're doing claims processing, you're looking through, the codes, what goes where the reimbursement is, and you can just go like this through that. But after you've been the supervisor, there you're not doing it all the time. You're coaching people, but it takes a little bit more thought, and you want to make sure you get it right anyway. And then when you get the manager, now you're further away from where it's happening. And so you're not as good at doing it, but you're good at getting other people to do it and to do it well. So you know the timing, the results. And so the skill really is to get, no longer is it to do the claim processing, it's to get everybody that works for you to do their absolute best to do claims processing quickly, efficiently, and correctly.
Another theme in your book is that you acknowledge that there are natural-born leaders, but I believe you expressed it that you think that most leaders are not natural-born leaders, that most of the time it's a learned skill. Talk about that.
I think there are some people, I will say, of all the leaders that I've met, the most charismatic, that's probably, in my view, more a natural-born leader, was President Bill Clinton. And, you talk to him, he just captures you. It's like almost you feel like you're the focus of his attention. But he can get people to do all sorts of things, quickly. And yet you go back to his history was, I think the first real leadership he had was the governor here in Arkansas. But I think he is a natural at leadership. Others just have to work at it. You have to look at what you do. And a lot of it is, if you're around somebody like him, you look at him and you say, what does he do? What would he do in the circumstances? What can I learn from that?
What I liked about your discussion, that you hit on that theme several times in the book, for those of us, which is the great majority of us, that at any given point in time, particularly in your 20s, would say, I'm not much of a leader. But it's reassuring, because what you're saying is, like, if you can become a general surgeon, if you can become a good customer service, you can learn. It's like any other skill that you can learn.
Yeah, and the most important thing is, there are two kinds of leaders. I think you mentioned it. There are the thought leaders, and there's the leaders of people. And thought leaders are the ones that come out with all the innovation things. The leaders of people are people that get other people to do their absolute very best. And you need to decide in advance, number one, do I want to be a thought leader more, or do I want to more lead people? And then you have to ask yourself, why do I want to lead people? And the right reason is because I can do a great job. Collectively, we can do a really great job together. A good reason is not because I want to make more money, or I want to do this, I want more prestige or something. If you go into it for the wrong reason, other than wanting to lead, wanting to make things better, you're not going to do well, and it will show up.
You use another phrase in your book, institutional energy. What do you mean by that?
That is one that, when you look at a battery, you know what the charge in the battery is. And that's the energy in the battery. And when you hook it up to something, the charge goes down. It drains. Well, when you think of a collection of people that are working together in an institution, and everybody's doing their best, that's a finite amount of energy that's being used. A little different, but theoretically it's the same. But if you start doing things, as you work and work and work, you drain energy. You refresh by going home in the night and coming back the next morning, by taking the weekend off, by taking a 1 or 2 week vacation, you can refresh it. But if the leaders start having nitpicking stuff, doing things that they don't need to do, getting rules that make it harder and harder to do this, all these things that impede the workers drains the institutional energy. And the more you drain it, the less institutional energy that's left. The idea, there used to be a thing of, we're going to go 100%. No, we're going to go 105%. Well, that will definitely drain institutional energy. But if you go 100% all the time, you're likely to do that too, unless people are encouraged, almost and sometimes required, to take a little bit of time off to recharge their own personal battery and their own personal life.
Why don't we close out with one final question? You distinguish between influence, power, and authority. Why don't you talk about that, and then we'll give you a chance to sell some books and talk to some of your friends.
Yeah. Well, it is basically, if you want somebody to do something, there are 3 basic tools to do it. Basic tool number 1 is you take a pistol and you point it at them and you say, you will do this. And that's power, because the answer is, okay, I'm going to do it. Don't shoot. So that's the use of power. It's unilateral and it's pretty much compulsory. And then there's the authority. Well, I'm the supervisor, I'm the manager. I'm telling you to do this, and you have to do it. And you don't want to do it because you don't think it's right there, whatever. I have the authority to fire you, so you will do what I say. And the only answer is, though, yes, you have the power and authority, the authority to fire me, but I got the authority to walk. And so it's not compulsory. It's almost compulsory, but it's bilateral because when you've got a pistol, the guy at the other end of the pistol doesn't have a choice. But with authority, they do have a choice. To me, the most effective is influence. It's sitting down and talking to people that are going to do things and saying, here's what we need to accomplish. I need you to think for a minute about what's the best way we can do this. Meanwhile, I got an idea, but we're thinking about it. And then I try and see if I can steer you or encourage you to do it a certain way. Or I can take that and say, well, let's kind of marry this up with something else and do it. So influence is getting people to want to do the right thing. And usually the right thing is what you want them to do, but you have to be willing to listen. And if it's not the right thing, then you have to modify it and do it. But influence is a mutual agreement. This is what we need to do in order to accomplish what we need to accomplish. And that, to me, is the most efficient and powerful method of leading people.
I wanted to do one little clarification. Earlier, when Dr. Griffin was talking about the day he was shot, he referred to his citation. He was given a Silver Star for his actions that day, and that was the citation he's referring to. Thank you all. Thank you, Dr. Griffin. Appreciate your service.
Well, thank you.